Side 3. The noise began soon after 6 the next morning, though you could hardly call it just a noise. It was a high-pitched wailing sound with a penetrating quality that woke Tom from a deep sleep and sat him bolt upright in bed. He staggered to the window to see what was going on. The noise, he realised, was coming from the garage, and without even bothering to put on his slippers, he ran downstairs and out of the back door. Outside, the noise was even louder, and in the garage it was almost deafening. It came from Aquila, and it was accompanied by a pulsating purple glow that came from the light on the centre of the dashboard. Only now there was not one flashing light, but two. For several seconds Tom stood there, wondering what to do. He knew that if the noise went on much longer, he would not be the only one coming to find out what was causing it. The only idea he could think of was to get in Aquila and fly it somewhere where the noise would attract less attention. But as he put a hand on the side to swing himself into the seat, the sound ceased. The purple lights were still flashing, but the garage was completely silent. Tom took his hand off Aquila and stepped back, but the noise did not return. He was still trying to work out what it all meant when he heard his mother calling. "Tom? What's going on?" Tom emerged from the garage to find his mother standing on the step outside the back door. "What on earth was all that noise about?" "I don't know," said Tom. "I was wondering myself. It sounded very close." Mrs. Baxter looked nervously around her for a moment, then stepped back in the kitchen. "I suppose it was some sort of alarm." "If it was an alarm," said Tom when Jeff came round and he told him what had happened, "then it must mean something's wrong." "It doesn't look as if anything's wrong." Jeff sat in Aquila as it hovered, solidly, 1/2 metre or so above the ground in Tom's garage. Apart from the flashing purple lights, there didn't seem to be anything different about it at all. Jeff was in fact less worried about Aquila making a noise than the news that Tom's mother had actually come out to investigate. The decision to keep Aquila in Tom's garage had been based on the knowledge that Mrs. Baxter never left the house. If she was going to start behaving normally, they would need to find somewhere else. "She's not getting cured or anything, is she?" he asked. "I think she's trying." His mother hadn't said anything about it, but Tom had noticed a pair of outdoor shoes by the door when he came home the previous evening. He pointed to the lights again. "I was wondering if they meant that something wasn't working right." "There's only one way to find out." Jeff put his hands on the controls. "Are you going to do the doors?" Tom opened the garage doors, and Jeff floated carefully outside, where he waited until his friend climbed in beside him. Keeping Aquila close to the ground, he flew slowly round the back of the house and into the garden. Everything seemed to move just as it should. Aquila went to the right and the left, up and down, and swung from side to side as it had always done. "All seems fine to me," said Jeff as he banked in a sweeping curve that took them somewhere over Mrs. Murphy's rose garden. "What was that?" Tom peered round. "I heard a noise, a sort of knocking sound." "I didn't hear anything." Jeff swung Aquila up and over the houses. "Don't worry, I'll keep us low, just in case." Neither of them noticed Mrs. Murphy standing in her rose garden. Several times in the last few days she'd heard voices when there was no one there, and this time, when she had reached up, she'd actually been able to touch and then knock on something solid in the empty air above her. The doctor had advised her to get out and about more. Maybe he was right. He'd also said that in an emergency she could take 2 of the new pills. As she tottered back to the house, she decided this was definitely an emergency. "Come in!" Miss Taylor was in her office, lunching off a couple of pork pies, and she motioned Mr. Urquhart to a chair. "You've heard about the maths?" Mr. Urquhart looked blank. "Peter Duncan found them yesterday in a classroom doing arithmetic for fun." Miss Taylor shook her head. "This thing's getting stranger by the day." "Well, it's partly about the boys I wanted to see you." Mr. Urquhart took a piece of paper from his briefcase. "Tom, anyway. I gave their class a test in geography this morning, and I thought you might like to see what he did." He passed the paper to Miss Taylor, who stared at it, a section of pork pie frozen in mid-bite. "I called it a general knowledge test," explained Mr. Urquhart, "to see how much they knew about geology. The first 10 questions were about recognizing types of rock. Some of the bright ones scored a few marks there, and then I gave them 10 more questions on putting geological ages in the right order. Nobody got any of those except Tom." Miss Taylor looked at the row of ticks down the page and then at the total at the bottom. 20 out of 20. To her certain knowledge, Tom had never come top in anything before. There were 36 in his form, and the highest position he had ever reached was equal 35th. "What I don't understand," said Mr. Urquhart, "is why he never produces anything like this in any of his other work. You don't think he's been deliberately hiding his intelligence?" "I know he's hiding something," said Miss Taylor. "I certainly never thought it might be intelligence." Tom was sitting with Jeff in Aquila outside the sweet shop between a couple of parked cars when a man walking along the pavement stopped in front of them and gave both boys a cheery smile. "My word! What's this, then?" He bent and tapped Aquila's hull. "Now, that's the sort of vehicle I'd like. I think you're very lucky. Wished I'd had one when I was your age." The man looked at the dash. "Flashing lights and everything, eh?" He smiled again and disappeared round the corner. "I thought we were supposed to be invisible," said Tom. "We were when I got in." Jeff was already climbing out to stand on the pavement. Both Aquila and Tom, he saw, were in full view. "I don't understand it." He checked briefly that no one was in sight. "Press the button again." As Tom pressed the button, Aquila disappeared. But the moment he took his finger away, it came back again. Eventually, they used a piece of sticking plaster from the first aid kit Mrs. Baxter put in Tom's school bag to tape over the switch and keep it on. It worked, but it was, as even Jeff admitted, a little disturbing. "Flashing lights, engine knock, and a dodgy invisibility button," he said. "Doesn't sound too healthy. What we need is a proper test flight. I'm going to take it out somewhere and put it through its paces. A few tight loops, hard turns, full throttle and plenty of speed changes. Then we'll see what breaks down." Tom had a feeling this might not be the way the professionals would conduct a safety check, but Jeff was very insistent. "If anything else is to go wrong," he said, "I think we need to know about it." Tom didn't argue. He just noticed a change to the flashing lights on the centre of the dash. There were 3 of them now. "What did his mother have to say?" asked Mr. Urquhart. "Did you get a chance to talk to her?" "I did," said Miss Taylor. "She came in to see me this morning." "She came in? Into the school?" "Yes." Miss Taylor hesitated. It hadn't been an easy interview. Mrs. Baxter, white and shaking, had gripped the sides of her chair and tried desperately to concentrate on answering the questions put to her, but when she'd passed out for the 3rd time, Miss Taylor had given up, carried her down to the car and driven her home. "You have to hand it to the woman," she said. "She was very determined, but I persuaded her you need expert help to face these things. The doctor said he'd lined someone up." "So she didn't say anything about Tom?" asked Mr. Urquhart. "She said he likes rocks." Miss Taylor glanced down at the test paper again. "But we already know that, don't we?" She had the distinct feeling that somewhere she'd missed something, an important clue. "Maybe we're going after the wrong person. Whatever they're doing, Jeff will be the one behind it, not Tom. He's the one we need to investigate." Miss Taylor finished the last of her pork pie. "I think I'll stop off at the newsagent's on my way home, see what his father thinks." They took Aquila to the park in the end. If anything did go wrong, Jeff argued, and they crashed, they would do much less damage on grass or the lake than if they were flying over houses and streets. It wasn't a thought that Tom found particularly consoling. Jeff flew 3 tight circuits. He began by hurtling over the water of the lake at a terrifying speed, then shot up through the trees over the brow of the hill, down the other side, through the subway tunnel, and a tight spin round to the main gates where they started. It was an exhilarating trip, and, as Tom pointed out at the end, you couldn't say anything was wrong at all. Jeff, however, was clearly not satisfied. "I was on full speed that last bit." "Yes." Tom was still trying to catch his breath. "Yes, it felt like that." "No, you don't understand." Jeff frowned. "You remember how fast we went the first time I pressed the button?" Tom remembered when they'd shot out of the cave. It had taken them under a second to go half a mile. They'd been travelling fast around the park, but not that fast. "You had the button full on?" he asked. "All the time?" Jeff paused for a moment. "I think I know what the flashing lights mean." "What?" They're to warn us we're running out of power. Jeff pointed to the sticking plaster taped over the invisibility button. It would explain that as well. It's trying to cut out anything that uses too much energy. For a moment, neither of the boys said anything, and then Tom broke the silence. It was a fairly obvious idea, but he thought it might be worth mentioning. Maybe we need to put in more petrol. Jeff looked at him. Well, I know it wouldn't be petrol, said Tom. It'd be something else. But if we found out what it was, we could maybe get some and put it in. Like what? Said Jeff. I mean, what powers a machine like this? Mr. Bamford, the physics teacher, was a short, balding man who usually enjoyed answering children's questions, but preferred not to do it at the end of the school day, when he was trying to get back to the staff room and smoke his pipe. However, when Jeff and Tom appeared in front of him, holding out a copy of the Sunday Mirror, he stopped to listen. As far as he could remember, neither of the boys had ever spoken to him before, and he was curious to hear what they wanted to say. "We were wondering what a UFO like this would have worked on," said Jeff. "You know, to make it go." "We thought possibly uranium," said Tom, "or plutonium." Mr. Bamford studied the blurred image of Aquila for a moment before handing it back to Jeff and setting off down the corridor towards the staff room. "I think any scientist would tell you that if there were such things as flying saucers, they would hardly be likely to run on anything as dangerous as radioactive isotopes." He took his pipe out of his pocket as he walked. "An advanced star-travelling technology would be capable of extracting the energy from more basic forms of matter." "Like what?" asked Jeff. "Anything. Did you know that theoretically there's enough energy in a sugar lump to supply a city the size of New York with electricity for a week?" "You're saying it runs on sugar lumps?" said Jeff. "I'm saying that if your technology is advanced enough, you could run something like that on any form of matter you choose. Anything at all." Mr. Bamford pushed open the door. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an important staff meeting to attend." It had been a disappointing conversation, Tom thought, as he and Jeff walked back to the domestic science block. If Aquila could be powered by anything, then their chances of finding out what it was were slim, to say the least. Not that it made much difference, he thought. Even if Mr. Bamford had told them exactly what Aquila needed, they'd still have the problem of finding where to put it. Aquila's hull had no visible openings that they'd ever found, not so much as a glove compartment. "I've been thinking about that," said Jeff when Tom told him. He paused with one foot on the bottom rung of the fire escape. "And maybe that's what we need to know first. Not what the fuel is, but where it goes." He started up the ladder and disappeared into Aquila. Tom followed him. "But we don't know where the fuel tank is, do we?" Jeff settled himself at the controls and gestured to the row of lights in front of them. "No, but I should imagine it's opened by one of these." The plan Jeff outlined was very simple. They'd press each of the lights in turn, starting at the top and working their way along the rows, and each time they pressed a button, they'd check to see if any secret doors or flaps opened up on Aquila. Both boys were acutely aware that the last time they'd pressed a button they'd started 11 fires, and Jeff suggested they took Aquila to some isolated part of the countryside. Then they discovered that Aquila would never make it to the open fields. As Jeff flew Aquila away from the side of the domestic science block, he found Aquila's top speed had slowed to little more than a walking pace, and Tom pointed out that there were now 4 of the purple lights flashing from the dash. Instead, they went to the park. It had a hill at one end, the remains of an Iron Age fort, with a hollow on the top that they hoped would not only conceal them from passers-by, but also prevent them doing too much damage if they found anything like the laser beam again. The first 3 buttons Jeff tried produced some interesting results, but none of them seemed to have anything to do with fuel. The first changed the colour of the underside of Aquila to a deep blue, for what reason they never discovered. The second heated the seats, unfortunately to a degree that was a shade more than comfortable, and the third produced a hologram in the air directly in front of them, consisting of 2 words: "Service Stow." The boys had no idea what either of them meant. The results of pressing the 4th button, however, were rather more dramatic. It started with a loud humming sound, and then a thread of blue light appeared from under Aquila. It was not a straight beam as the laser had been, but more like a moving coil that undulated over the grass in front of them, writhing like a snake and rapidly extending in length as if reaching out for something. Tom found it slightly unnerving and wanted to turn it off, but Jeff wasn't so sure. "It could be a fuel line," he said hopefully as the blue light twisted its way up to the lip of the hollow. "Maybe it's looking for fuel, and when it finds some, it'll bring it back." If Tom thought this was unlikely, it was no more unlikely than most of the things that had happened since they found Aquila. Reynolds' newsagent stood at the end of a row of 4 shops, serving a housing estate on the east side of Staveley. When Miss Taylor walked in, both Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds were serving behind the counter, and the shop was busy with customers. Mr. Reynolds, a large, confident, good-looking man, gave her a cheery wave as soon as he saw her, and, ignoring everyone in the queue, came over to ask how he could help. "I wanted a word about Jeff, if you had a moment," said Miss Taylor. "But don't worry if you're busy. I'm quite happy to wait." "Wouldn't hear of it." Mr. Reynolds led Miss Taylor to a door at the back of the shop. "Can't keep a busy woman like you waiting, Miss Taylor. You come on through." Experience had taught him that it wasn't wise to leave Miss Taylor in the shop for any length of time. In the course of her career, she had taught a good many of his customers, and she had a habit, if given the chance, of telling them not to waste their money on chocolate and reminding them how unhealthy it was to buy cigarettes. He ushered her straight through to the sitting room and pulled up a chair. "So, what trouble's he in this time, then? Nothing too serious, I hope?" "Oh, it's not really trouble at all," said Miss Taylor. "It's just his behaviour recently has been a little odd." She hesitated. It wasn't easy to put what she felt into words. "He's been seen in the library a couple of times, and he's been asking questions in class, wanting to know about things." "Asking questions?" Mr. Reynolds' face furrowed with concern. "Right, I'll have a word with him about that." No, we don't mind," said Miss Taylor. "In fact, it's the sort of thing we encourage. It's just that Jeff's never done it before. It seems to have started on this geography field trip he went on. You haven't noticed anything different about his behaviour since then?" Mr. Reynolds thought for a moment, then shook his head. "There's nothing he's done?" persisted Miss Taylor. "Nothing he's said or talked about?" "I could ask Mrs. Reynolds," he said. "I know she listens to the lad sometimes." Mrs. Murphy was walking home through the park, her shopping trolley loaded with cat food. As she paused to catch her breath at the point where the path circled the crest of the old fort, the sound of a low humming caused her to look up. The noise grew louder, and a moment later a cord of blue light appeared over the edge of the hill, paused for a second as if it were an animal sniffing the air, and then turned towards Mrs. Murphy. Mrs. Murphy backed away, but the light was already moving straight towards her, purposefully humming its way down the side of the hill, gathering speed as it did so. In rising panic, Mrs. Murphy began to run. She moved with remarkable speed for an 83-year-old with bad legs, but she was no match for the light. In a last desperate effort to get away, she abandoned her trolley and then watched in horror as a second later the blue light caught it, engulfed it, and began dragging it back up the hill. "My shopping!" called Mrs. Murphy to anyone who could hear her. "Help! It's taken my shopping and my purse! It's stolen my purse!" Sitting in Aquila, Jeff and Tom could not hear Mrs. Murphy's cries, but they watched in fascination as the tip of the blue light reappeared over the brow of the hill, pulling something along with it. "Wow! What's that?" "I'm not sure," said Tom, "but it looks like a shopping trolley." Jeff reached out and turned off the button. The light disappeared, and the trolley fell over sideways on the grass. In the silence, they could hear Mrs. Murphy calling for help, then a man's voice asking what had happened. "We'd better get out of here," said Tom. "Right." Jeff pulled the sticky tape over the invisibility button and put his hands on the controls. There were several voices now, and they were getting nearer. "Jeff, I think we should go home. Now." "We can't." A bead of perspiration trickled down Jeff's face. His thumb was pressing the up button as hard as he could. "This is it! Full speed!" He stood up briefly and then sat down again. "And we're not invisible either. Both boys could hear the voices drawing closer. Several people were scrambling up the other side of the slope, and in a few seconds' time, the men looking for Mrs. Murphy's shopping trolley would come over the hill. They'd see the boys and Aquila. They'd ask questions. They'd want to know. It was finished. The whole adventure was over, and there was nothing they could do about it. Jeff's hands fell from the controls and they waited. As if to express how they felt, it suddenly started to rain. Miss Taylor's conversation had not been as productive as she'd hoped. According to Mrs. Reynolds, her son had no new interests, hobbies or friends, and was behaving in exactly the way he'd always done. He did go out a bit more these days, she admitted, but she had no idea where he went. "I'm sorry he's causing you all this bother," said Mr. Reynolds as Miss Taylor finally stood up to leave, "but I'll have a word with him, make sure he keeps out of the library, that sort of thing." "Please don't." Miss Taylor sometimes wondered if Jeff's father had fully grasped what children going to school was really about. "In fact, I'd rather you didn't mention that I'd been here at all, if that's all right." "Anything you say," said Mr. Reynolds cheerfully. As he led Miss Taylor back out to her car, he suddenly remembered something. "There is one thing he's got interested in, just this last week, too." Mr. Reynolds couldn't imagine why he hadn't thought of it before. "UFOs. He's got interested in flying saucers. He likes me to check in the morning, see if there's anything about them in the papers." Mr. Reynolds smiled happily. "There. I knew there was something." "Thank you," said Miss Taylor. It wasn't the sort of information she'd expected, but she filed it carefully away in her mind as she put the car into gear and drove off. It might only be a small piece of the jigsaw, but experience had taught her that was always how you arrived at the final picture, one piece at a time. It was Tom who noticed it first. It was raining quite hard, one of those sudden heavy showers that can soak you to the skin before you even have time to open the umbrella, but neither of them was getting wet. Nor was Aquila. As Tom looked, he could see the raindrops splashing down towards the hull, but somehow, without ever seeming to connect. Aquila's surface remained perfectly dry, as if the rain was being absorbed before it could land. A man's face appeared over the brow of the hill. He was an elderly figure with a walking stick, which he pointed down the slope. "There it is!" He started walking towards the shopping trolley on its side on the grass. Another man, a park attendant, scrabbled up the slope to join him. "I'll get it, you wait here." He had his coat pulled over his head to keep off the rain, and he climbed down towards the trolley as two more men appeared, half carrying, half dragging a rather bedraggled Mrs. Murphy. "This your trolley, missus?" asked the park attendant as he pulled it upright. Mrs. Murphy nodded. "Why aren't they looking at us?" said Jeff. "Why haven't they said anything?" "I don't think they can see us." Tom was still looking at the water not landing on Aquila. He'd suddenly remembered what Mr. Bamford had said about an advanced technology being able to extract energy from almost anything. He pointed to the purple lights at the centre of the dash. Only two of them were flashing now, and, as he watched, one of those blinked into stillness. Water! Tom could hardly believe it, even as he said it. It runs on water! That evening, in the garage, Tom filled Aquila from a garden hose. It was a strange sight. The water cascaded onto Aquila's hull and disappeared. For almost 2 hours he ran the tap at full flow, and for almost 2 hours the water vanished somewhere into Aquila, before suddenly splashing off the surface and onto the floor, and Tom hurriedly went to turn off the tap. As the water was running, Tom tried to calculate how much of it Aquila was taking on. He knew the hose could fill a 2-gallon watering can in about half a minute, so in 2 hours, Aquila must have absorbed quite a lot. He thought it might be worth working out exactly how much, as it seemed to be more than there was physically room for it to hold, which would be interesting. Jeff left Tom to look after the water. Sitting in Aquila, he pressed the third button from the left on the top, and watched as a hologram of words appeared in the air in front of him. "Servers stow." Laboriously, he set about copying the words, one letter at a time, onto a piece of paper. He had a strong desire to find out what they meant. Mr. Urquhart looked at the bit of paper and then at Jeff. "Where did you find this?" "We saw it written down somewhere." "And you want to know what it means?" Mr. Urquhart stared at the bit of paper again. "It's in Latin." "Latin?" Jeff tried to sound as if this were only a casual interest. "Which wasn't my best subject," continued Mr. Urquhart, "though I did scrape a GCSE. He handed the paper back to Jeff. "How can I help you?" "Well, we want to find out what it means." "That is what it means." The bell rang for the start of lessons, and Mr. Urquhart sat down at his desk. Roughly speaking, a literal translation would be, "I stand ready to serve." Jeff and Tom walked to their seats at the back of the class. It was better than either of them had dared hoped. If a machine asks how it can help you, then it is probably expecting you to ask for some sort of help. And there were plenty of ways the boys could think that Aquila might be able to do that. Unfortunately, it had asked them in Latin, presumably a consequence of the fact that it had belonged to a Roman, so conversation wasn't going to be easy. "Try the library at lunchtime, shall we?" murmured Jeff as they sat down. The books on Latin in the library were ink-stained and shabby, and dated from the days when learning Latin at school had been as commonplace as doing maths or English. There were dictionaries, grammars, a copy of Caesar's Gallic Wars, and a paperback called Latin Made Simple, written for people who were trying to teach themselves. Tom started with the dictionaries. Jeff's idea was that they should make up a simple question in Latin to ask Aquila. It didn't matter what the question was, he said. All they needed was something they could try out. If Aquila answered the question, even if it was an answer the boys could not understand, they would at least know they were on the right track. But it was turning out to be more difficult than they thought. Jeff had suggested translating something short like, "What does this light do?" or "How high can you go?" But even such simple sentences weren't easy to translate. The dictionary, for instance, didn't have anything for the word "does," but had a choice of 9 different words for "can." Looking at the grammar books was no help at all. They were filled with pages of details about irregular deponent verbs of the 4th conjugation that meant nothing to the boys at all. "Typical, isn't it?" muttered Jeff. "What? The one subject that might actually be useful, and schools don't teach it anymore." Tom was flipping through the pages of Latin Made Simple. "If it doesn't matter what we ask, I suppose we could try one of these." He pointed to one of the exercises set at the end of a chapter. It was a series of sentences to be turned into Latin, and 1 or 2 of them were questions. "I know they're in English here," said Tom, "but it's got the answers at the back of the book." "What sort of questions?" asked Jeff. "Are they in the garden with the boys?" read Tom. It wasn't exactly the sort of thing you were burning to know, Jeff thought, but it might serve their purpose. The news was greeted in the staff room with understandable disbelief. "They're what?" asked Miss Taylor. "They're teaching themselves Latin." Miss Poulsen couldn't help smiling as she said it. Graham Urquhart found them in the library. "Reynolds and Baxter? Learning Latin?" Miss Taylor stared at her across the coffee table. "Are you serious?" "I know it's odd," said Miss Poulsen, "but that's what they were doing." "It's not odd. It's unbelievable." Miss Taylor frowned. "What did Graham say exactly?" "Just that he found them at one of the tables surrounded by dictionaries, notepads and paper, beavering away." "Oh, this is ridiculous," snorted Miss Taylor. "Those 2 boys are doing something, and I demand to know what it is." Jeff pressed the button. Servus Stowe appeared in the air just as before, and Tom read out the first of the questions he had highlighted in the book. "Sunt ne in horto cum pueris?" The reply was instantaneous. "Nescio." "It talks." "Unfortunately," said Tom, "it only talks Latin." He started carefully copying the word onto a piece of paper. "I wonder what it means." "We can find out what it means." "Go on, ask it one of the others." Tom read the next question from the book. "Cur magistri puellas oppugnabant." It meant, why were the masters attacking the girls? And again, Aquila's reply was instantaneous. "Quae puellae." "Oh, this is great!" Jeff smiled happily. "This is fantastic! Give us another one, go on!" When he finished copying the reply, Tom asked the next question, and the result this time was a lot more than a couple of words. Whole pages of writing suddenly filled the air in front of them, arranged in a curved space around them that was over 2 meters long and about 1 meter high. "Wow!" breathed Jeff. "What did you ask that time?" "Which country do you come from?" said Tom. He knew he'd never be able to copy down all the reply, but he made a start on the first sentence. Neat. Really neat. Jeff nodded happily. His only worry was how long it might take Tom to translate all these replies. In the library, when they had asked Mr. Urquhart how long it took people to learn Latin, he had said 8 or 9 years was not uncommon. Jeff didn't want to wait that long. What they needed was some expert help. Are you sure they weren't winding you up? Quite sure. In the library, Mr. Urquhart was showing Miss Taylor the table where the boys had been working. In fact, I only found what they were doing by accident. They were trying to keep it a secret. A secret? They had a couple of football annuals propped up to hide what they were doing. If I hadn't come behind them to put some books away, I'd never have known. Miss Taylor shook her head. She still found the whole thing very difficult to believe. I'm calling a meeting for 4 o'clock this afternoon, she said. I want anyone who teaches those boys or has even talked to them in the last fortnight to be there. We have to get to the bottom of this. Is that all right with you? Of course. And we'll need all the information we can get. I wonder when the last time was that anyone searched their desks. Searched their... Mr. Urquhart looked rather startled. Wouldn't that be an invasion of privacy? Miss Taylor gave him a pitying glance. You'd better come with me to the classroom and show me where they sit. She led the way out of the library. You've really no idea what this Latin business is about? None at all. Mr. Urquhart followed the deputy headmistress down the corridor to the form room. It just seemed they wanted to learn. Tom even asked if I could give him lessons, but I told him I wouldn't be much use. I said they need someone like Mr. Hodge. Mr. Hodge had come to Staveley Boys' Grammar School 35 years before to teach Latin and Greek. As the years passed, the demand for these subjects had declined. The grammar school had become a comprehensive, and Mr. Hodge had had to adapt his teaching abilities to other areas. At the moment, he taught something called home skills, which involved helping young people to learn the things they'd need to know when they had houses and families of their own. It was not a job that suited him. Mr. Hodge had no family, and his house was notoriously unhygienic. He was due to retire in a year, and the Board of Governors prayed that no student would actually die in one of his safety in the home lessons before then. It looked like being a close-run thing. When Tom and Jeff found him, he was setting out some ironing boards and irons, ready to teach 5D the finer points of ironing a shirt. He had snagged his fingers twice and had a nasty burn on his forearm, which he was running under the cold tap. "What do you want?" he asked when he saw the boys. He had a nervous, hunted look, and regarded most children with some suspicion. "If it's not too much trouble," said Jeff, "we wondered if you could tell us what this means." He passed over the paper on which Tom had written the replies that Aquila had made. Mr. Hodge looked at the paper. "I don't know." "I thought you used to teach Latin," said Tom. "I did." Mr. Hodge took his arm from under the cold tap and put on his glasses. "That's what nescio means. First person singular of the verb not to know. The next one is, what, girls? And this last paragraph is really rather interesting." He looked up at the boys. "Where did you get this?" "It's a sort of puzzle," said Jeff. "Is it? It's not a text I've come across before, but it seems clear enough." A curious change had come over Mr. Hodge's face as he studied the words. The hunted look had disappeared, and his eyes glinted with enthusiasm. "It says, 'This life raft was made by the people of Deneb in the 4th decade of the reign of the Emperor Debengpa, as part of one of the many flying warships built to defend his property from the treacherous and deceitful Irlian.'" He paused. "Does that mean anything to you?" "Where's Deneb?" asked Tom. "I've no idea." Mr. Hodge shook his head. "The only Deneb I've heard of is a star Somewhere in the constellation of Cygnus. Would that fit your puzzle at all? Yes. Jeff nodded slowly. It might fit rather well. It's beautifully phrased. Mr. Hodge read the Latin to himself once more, relishing the words as they rolled off his tongue. But before he could finish, the water in the sink overflowed onto the power cable leading to one of the irons. There was a loud bang as the fuse blew, and Mr. Hodge stepped back in alarm. He tripped over the end of an ironing board, banged his head on the corner of a table, and fell to the floor. Tom and Jeff waited with him till the ambulance arrived. It seemed the least they could do in return for his help, though they were both anxious to write down the translation he had given them before they forgot it. As soon as she saw it, Miss Taylor knew that she had found what she was looking for. The exercise book had been lying quite openly in Tom's desk. On the cover was written Aquila in large capital letters, and underneath it was a drawing of an eagle carrying a banner in its mouth with the words, Licet volare si intergo Aquilae volat. She flipped through the pages in which Tom had carefully recorded everything that had happened since the day Jeff had fallen into the cave. As well as the writing, there were maps, newspaper cuttings, and drawings of the dashboard of Aquila, with careful descriptions of what some of the lights did. As Miss Taylor turned the pages, everything slotted into place. However unlikely, she knew there was only one explanation that could possibly fit all the facts. She passed the book to Mr. Urquhart, who riffled through it, and gave a low whistle. "We need a photocopy," said Miss Taylor, "and then we have to get this book back in his desk before afternoon lessons. I don't want them to suspect anything. Not yet." They finally had the answer they'd been looking for, Jeff realized. At the front of the class, Miss Poulsen was talking about the Treaty of Versailles, but Jeff, in a world of his own, was not even pretending to listen. Aquila could talk. They could ask it what each of the various buttons did. They could find out when it had been made, and who for. They could ask it what the matter was if anything went wrong. It could tell them what it could do, how it worked, who the Irillians were. The answers, of course, would be in Latin, and they would not be able to ask Mr. Hodge for translations on any regular basis, not without arousing suspicion, but Tom would get the hang of it eventually. Jeff had great faith in his friend. He was a lot smarter than most people realized. Beside him, Tom was busily filling in the details of the day's events in the exercise book he had taken from his desk. "It explains why there was nothing written down at the site, doesn't it?" he whispered. "What? I always wondered why the Centurion didn't have anything written down, like a book of instructions to remind him what all the lights did." Tom pointed to his exercise book. "I mean, I've written everything down, but he didn't have to, did he? All he had to do was ask." Jeff looked at Tom's book. "You've written everything down in there?" "Yes." Tom looked up. "Why? What's wrong?" "Nothing really," said Jeff. "Only I don't think you should leave it in your desk. We don't want anyone else to find it, do we?" The start of Miss Taylor's meeting was delayed for some minutes by the late arrival of Mr. Hodge, who had been at the hospital having his head x-rayed. But at 4:15, it finally got under way. "I'd like to thank you all for giving up your time at such short notice." The deputy headmistress looked round at the dozen or so members of staff seated in her office. "As you've possibly heard, I am concerned about the activities of two boys, Tom Baxter and Jeff Reynolds, who were found this morning in the library trying to teach themselves Latin." A murmur of shock and concern ran round those of the staff who had not yet heard about this. "In the last 4 days," continued Miss Taylor, "these same boys have approached Derek Bamford to ask about advanced power technologies. They asked Amy Poulsen about the early navigation techniques used in the flying corps, and Peter Duncan found them on Monday trying to solve a maths problem in their free time for fun." "They were at it again this morning," Mr. Duncan chipped in. "Came to me at the end of the lesson wanting to work out something about a tap, a watering can, and how big was the bath it filled in 2 hours. "Thank you, Peter." It was the first Miss Taylor had heard about that one. "Now, that is exactly why we are here. I want to know what's going on, and the first thing we need to do is pool any information we have on their behaviour." She looked around the room. "Has anyone else noticed these boys doing anything odd in the last week or so?" 8 people put their hands up. End of side 3.